All right, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to start in the book of Hebrews. Book of Hebrews. All right. Today we're going to have a discussion on, or start a discussion. I don't know how far we'll get. And I hope that if any of you have any comments or questions or want to participate in this, that you'll feel free to do so. Don't be afraid of interrupting me. I don't mind at all. And it doesn't just have to be a question. If you want to participate, if you want to comment, you can do so. But I want to have a discussion on the existence of God. There's many ways to look at this. Leanne gave us one of them, which would be more aligned with the way that you would see this discussion in 1 John, right? 1 John dealt with the way Leanne talked about it, is how, the personal experience perspective of this, how we know there's a God based on what we've personally experienced. That is not, nowadays, if you listen to alleged, scientists, it's not really science, but what nowadays passes for science, they'll tell you that's no good, but it is good. This whole discussion, if you read the book of 1 John, it's about what you've experienced. How do you know that there's a God? And that's what Leanne talked about. But and there's other ways of looking at this. Most of you who have been in evangelical churches, fundamentalist churches, have heard the doctrinal perspective, where they basically say the Bible says there's a God, and we believe the Bible, and we believe the Bible's true, and therefore there's a God. Now, that is not also a bad way of looking at this, and it's very compelling for many people. There are people that will read the Bible and become convinced there's a God because the Bible tells them there's a God. And you may think, well, that doesn't sound scientific, but what does sound scientific? If you read a science journal that tells you that something exists that you can't see and you believe it, is that different, right? And so that is. But that's not how I want to look at it. I want us to look at it from a different perspective. So I want us to look at it from a purely philosophical perspective, which is why we're calling this the first cause, because it's a philosophical term, and it has to do with what brought things into existence, okay? And so we're going to look at it from that perspective. We're going to read a couple verses where this is kind of implied, but this really isn't going to be a Bible study. It's going to be like we've been doing on a few other things. We're going to do some thinking about this and considering it. And I don't want you to think that in any way I'm trying to diminish the Bible. There is a doctrinal viewpoint on this that's very valid, right? Where we could go to the Bible and read hundreds of verses that talk about God and there's a God. And I'm not saying that that's wrong or that is a weak case. It is a very strong case. It's just a different case, okay? And there's something that I think we have to understand. Something cannot be doctrinally true if it's mathematically false, okay? This is the problem I think that traditional fundamentalists have, that they hold to what they consider to be doctrinally true, even if it is mathematically wrong. Thinking, well, if it's doctrinally true, it doesn't matter if it's mathematically wrong. No, that is not the case. They misunderstand doctrine then. If there was a doctrine, if we held a doctrine that said that 2 plus 2 equals 5, that doctrine would be wrong. It's just wrong. Okay? So you can't have something that is doctrinally true and mathematically false. It can't be doctrinally true and scientifically false. There are Christians today, in fact, I had a discussion, a semi-discussion with one recently, who believe that the earth is flat. I'm saying they really do. They are completely convinced the earth is flat. Now, you laugh, I laugh, but this is not real. They're fringe. It is fringe, but it's not as fringe as you might think. And a lot of these people, flat earthers, are fundamentalist Christians, basing this ridiculous idea, and it is completely ridiculous. And we won't get into that, but it is the most absurd thing you've ever heard. It's just, people ask, they'll say, well, how do you know that the earth isn't flat? Because I see it every night. You look at the moon, and there's the shadow of the earth, and it's an orb. It's not just a circle, it is a sphere. Okay? This has nothing to do with who took a photo from outer space and whether that's reliable. You can look up with your own eyes and see the shadow of the earth, and it is always a sphere. Anyway, where do they get these ideas? Well, they get them from the Bible. The four corners of the earth, and they got all kinds of verses they pull out and they go, that's the doctrine. It is not doctrinally true if it is scientifically false. The Bible and real science are not in opposition. They are not. Now, there is a thing called scientism, false, what Paul called, and he was way ahead of his time, he called it science falsely so called. He says there's a science that's not real science. Okay, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about real science. And there's nothing wrong with real science. And we have come to realize that certain doctrines that Christians have held actually are false because science has shown us that we weren't understanding things properly. And we've had to readjust some things. And that should not ever cause you any fear. We do not dictate to science what science should be based on doctrine. That's a wrong way of going about it. And so if you're here and you're thinking, well, Christians they just believe the Bible and they don't care what science says, you haven't met the right Christians. I read scientific papers as much or more as I read the Bible. I'm very interested in real science, and we're going to be looking at some of that today. So it can't be doctrinally true if it's scientifically false. It can't be doctrinally true if it's mathematically false. It cannot be doctrinally true if it's philosophically false. Truth is not just truth in one way. It has to be true in all ways for it to be true. Okay? So this is not about saying that the Bible is weak or it's a weak way, but it is that there are multiple ways of considering truth. And so we're going to look at it in a different way. But let's look at a couple verses where I think this kind of gets us started on this. So the first one's in Hebrews. It's chapter 11. It says, but without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is. Must believe that he is. That's the key thing I want you to look at. This is where it starts off. You must believe that he is. So this is what we're going to look at today. Is he? You must believe that God is. I think this is brilliant to start it this way. Paul says, look, this is the first point. Does God exist? Is he? And we also find this in Exodus. God says it. And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, thus thou shalt say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. So he's just saying, Moses wants to know, who exactly are you? And he says, I am what I am. Now, that means, basically, you just have to accept whatever I am. And this is actually quite important as we discuss this. And we're going to get to it, especially when we get to what's called the problem of evil. I think this is a very key phrase that you have to understand about God. But this is kind of where we're going to start. And so we're going to look at some different things. So the question is, and I want you to consider this not from a biblical perspective again. I want you to consider this from a philosophical perspective. Does God exist? Okay, so what do we mean when we say, does God exist? What do we mean by God? Well, if you're looking at it from a biblical perspective, you're talking about this personal relationship with a father figure, if you will, right? And he has a name, and he has a character, and we have a lot of attributes about him, and we say, well, God is this. That is not how we're going to look at it. We're going to look at it from the most basic way. What would God be in the most basic philosophical sense? And that would be, God is the first cause. So where did things come from? This is a problem that all science has. Okay, so when you go to pretty much any type of school or anywhere where they're going to discuss this, they generally are going to tell you that they have this figured out, and they're lying. And it's not just because I say so. I can give you some references of some really important scientists. We're talking about world-class scientists like James Tour who will tell you from their expert opinion dealing with Nobel laureates in science that scientists do not know. They cannot tell you where everything comes from. What they do is they start after everything is there and tell you how things became as they are. But that is a very different conversation. How did an amoeba turn into a monkey? Well, that's a very different consideration over where did the very first elements come from. That is what we're talking about. This is not a discussion on evolution. For or against. I don't even care right now about that. This is about where did that beginning elements come from. If there were evolution, they had to start with something. Any true evolutionary process starts with something. But where did that come from? And science does not have an answer for that right now. They don't. None of them do. And so that is what we're talking about. When we talk about God, is there a God? We're talking about, is there an entity or a being or some type of intelligent force that can bring into existence from nothing? And that's all we're talking about. We're not talking about if Jesus was God in the flesh. We're not talking about as if there were miracles. We're not talking about any of that. All we're saying is there this intelligent being, this intelligent force, a personal creator who can bring out of nothing something? Whatever that is, whether it's the primordial soup as it's called, or whether it's a complete universe in perfect working order like Genesis would seem to indicate. It doesn't matter what it is, but from nothing create something. Is there something there? Now, if we don't have that intelligent being who can do that, then you have to ask yourself, well, then how does that happen? And they don't have an answer. The best they have is the idea of random chance. Of course, that has to start with something also, right? But we'll just give them that because it's a discussion that really doesn't have a good answer. But let's talk about random chance as being the way in which something happened. So I just want to give you an idea, like Leanne mentioned that, she didn't know if she had a way of explaining it. Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of information. This is very little bit. We don't have a lot of time. But I want to give you a little bit of information to explain how hard it is to explain things with random chance. So I just want to give you a little sampling of this. So we're going to look at random chance, right? And so we're going to look at it in the sense of proteins, all right? So proteins bind together into sequences. And when they do that, if the sequence is right, what happens is these little chains, I'm going like this, they're actually very, very small. But you got these little chains of proteins, and they bind together, right? And then they fold, if they're in the right order. They naturally will fold up and become what they call a machine. And they actually have 3D depictions of these that show you what they look like, and they're truly amazing. They are so small. I mean, you're talking about you can park like 50,000 of them on the breadth of a human hair. An average human cell, they calculate, has about 80 million of these little molecular machines in it. See, this is very interesting because before this, we realized this, we used to think of cells as being like this glob of basically like flubber, right? This little glob of like stuff. And now we realize it's not that at all. It's actually like a little city with like 80 million of these little machines working inside, doing things, all kinds of things, amazing things. And you can do it. We don't have time to go into them, but this is what they are. And how do those machines come about? Well, these proteins all stick together and they turn into this chain, and then because of the way they're stuck together, it's because of the order that they're stuck together in, right? Then they fold up. They like fold up and they turn into a working machine. I want to give you an idea of just what we're talking about. So in the tip of your finger, there are more of these machines than humans have created in all of history. In the tip of one tip of your finger, there are more machines of these type than all the machines that humanity has built in all of history. Okay? Amazing things. You can read up on them. James Tour is actually one of the premier experts, or the premier expert on this. He builds these machines. He takes and chemically creates these little molecular machines. In fact, he entered into what was the Le Mans race, right? If you've watched Ford versus Ferrari, he won the Le Mans race of the molecular machines. He made a little car that he could drive with light, and he beat all the other nations. His car was the fastest. Amazing little thing he did. Anyways, and he's a Christian. Very strong fundamentalist Christian, and believes in God. And you can go on YouTube. He has tons of things talking about this. A lot of this information I got from him, because he actually builds these. Okay? He actually builds these molecular machines. So let's talk about those and what it would take to build one of those by sheer random chance. Okay? So if you had all the right ingredients, right? You had all the right elements in this primordial soup. They're floating around in the ocean, and you give it the best possible scenario of producing these, and they randomly start joining up in different orders, in different sequences. How many times would they have to randomly create a string until you got one working molecular machine? 10 to the 164th power. That's a 1 with 164 zeros after it. That's how many random iterations you'd have to go through to get one of these proteins, one of these molecular structures. Just one. Remember, each cell in your body has an average of 80 million of them. The simplest cell we can find has 300 of them. That's the simplest cell we can find, has 300 of these in it. And to get one simple one, one short one, 1 to the 164th power. Let me give you an appreciation for what this is, how many this is. So how many stars are there in the universe? 10 to the 21st power. That's stars in the universe. Okay, well, let's get it. Surely there's a bigger number than 10 to the 164. So how many atoms? How many atoms are there in the universe? Anybody? 10 to the 82nd power. 10 to the 82nd power. That's atoms in the entire universe. So here maybe this will give you a better appreciation for how long it would take to randomly generate a single protein. So let's say you had a road that went from one side of the known universe to the other side. Very, very long road. Obviously not made by TxDOT. Okay, very long road. And you put on that road a little car that travels at 1 foot per year. Okay, it travels at 1 foot per year. And all the car does is go back and forth. It's like a little dump truck. And every time it goes to the other side of the universe at 1 foot per year, you put one atom in the dump truck. And it hauls it across the universe and dumps it off and comes back for another one. Okay, so 1 foot per year, 1 atom per trip, and you have to move all the atoms in the universe. How many of the atoms of the universe could you move in the time it took to randomly generate one protein? You could move all of them 56 million times before that protein would generate. Move all the atoms in the universe at 1 foot per year across the entire universe over 56 million times before a randomly generating sequence of proteins could come up with a workable molecular machine. One. Now here's the problem with this also. It gets worse. This is all the easy stuff, so it gets worse. One does nothing for you. These are all codependent machines. Not one of them can survive on its own. They all depend on all the others. One of these correctly structured molecular machines would do nothing for you. You need to generate all 300 of them. all at the same time, because they have a very short lifespan by themselves. Very short. The idea that science says is that really all you got to do is give us enough time. If you give us enough time, we can fix everything. But here's the problem that they're coming up against when we're talking about these proteins and these molecular machines. These things are very time sensitive. Time is not the friend of creating these molecular structures. They're the enemy. They have to be created very, very quickly and in the right order all at the same time. And you can't step back one or two steps when you mess up and start from there. You have to start all over from the beginning, every time from the beginning. Which means you don't get to save because random chance doesn't have a notebook where it can keep track of everything it did wrong. It just has to start over from the beginning every time. Mathematically, this is as close as to impossible as a mathematician will allow. Oh my goodness. You will have won the lottery. The lottery is easy. It's possible. This is as, look, a mathematician will never say something is impossible. They just tack on more of those little numbers at the end of a number.
They say highly
improbable. That's right. Highly improbable. Where did these begin? This is just one thing. Look, this isn't like the death knell of materialism, but this is a very strong argument against the idea that you have an unintelligent first cause. The problem here isn't whether there's a God or not. It's that without intelligence of some sort, and we're not talking about human intelligence, we're talking about that somehow there is a process that can keep track of what it has done, where it went wrong, and can restart things mid-sequence. That requires intelligence. Randomness doesn't do that. Randomness has no sense of history.
By definition.
Exactly, by definition, has no sense of history. Random processes will just do things randomly.
We refer to them as memory processes.
There you go.
Therefore, they're random.
That's right. Meaning that, it's like a dice. You could have a dice, right? You have 6 numbers on the dice, and the chances that you roll a number are all equal. There's not like well, I have a favorite number, I win. That's just nonsense. Unless the dice is weighted, right, wrong, if it is perfectly random, there is no better chance to roll one number over another number anytime. And you say, well, I rolled 3 6s in a row, so I can't get another one. Actually, the 4th time, it makes no difference. The dice has no knowledge of what it came up with any time before. Every time, you have the exact same odds of rolling a 6, every single time.
Called independent trial.
That's right. So how do we account for the existence, let's say, of these proteins that we're talking about? Well, random chance is a very difficult way to account for that. Intelligent design, if you will, is a very much better way. I can't find anybody, and I can't in my own mind figure out any other way to account for such a thing than that something had to know what was the best order to put something in, or had to have originated that design to know what to put it in to create this. Because we're not talking about 1 or 2 or 3. We're talking about millions upon millions of these have to be generated. And this is just one element. We could talk about all other kinds of things that don't work out with random chance, okay? So that gives you an idea. So then we think, when we think about this, we think, well then, is there another argument we can look at? So I want to look at an argument that is called the cosmological argument, and this is made popular by a man named William Lane Craig. You can look him up. He's a Christian philosopher, and he does a lot of debates with atheists and materialists, naturalists, and this is an argument he relies on. Very compelling. So let's look at what's called the cosmological argument, or the Kalam cosmological argument, and think about what this means as far as there being a God now. Because we looked at random chance and the difficulties with making that be a meaningful explanation for the existence of things. But let's look at this argument. So this argument goes like this. It's 3 parts, and it's really simple. Everyone can get a hold of this. I don't think anyone will have a trouble understanding the 3 parts of this argument. So we'll look at them. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now this is basically simple science. We've known this forever. Science, this is, if you study science at all in any type of traditional sense, you know this. If something begins to exist, it has a cause, okay? Something caused it to begin to exist. Nothing exists out of its own volition. If it begins to exist, it had to have a cause. Something caused it to happen, okay? Second point of this argument is, the universe began to exist. Now, this is not a statement of faith.
That's right.
This is a statement that pretty much all science agrees. There used to be the idea that what's kind of called the steady state, which was everything just always was. It's just eternal. The universe just floats in an ether, and it just has always been there. But this has been completely disproven. Nobody, not even atheist scientists, think the universe has no beginning. They all believe it had a beginning. Why? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is that it's rapidly expanding all the time. And you know, basically what you'd call it, the theory or the point of faith of naturalism is that whatever you see happening now can be extrapolated backwards consistently. So if the universe is rapidly expanding right now, flying apart, that means that at one time it was all together, according to them. Now, you know, whether that's true, that's a different point, but that is what they believe. Everything was down. In fact, they believe that the entire universe was compressed into a single pinpoint. And then what they call the Big Bang colloquially, but it had rapid explosion, boom, blew apart, and it's expanding ever since. Okay, so the universe began to exist. There was a point in time when it began to exist. Okay? What does that mean then? Well, therefore, the universe has a cause. If the universe began to exist, and everything that begins to exist has a cause, then the universe must have a cause. Something caused it to come into being. Now, we could say that it was random chance, but that just doesn't account for anything. That is a very hard explanation.
It can't even be an explanation because you have to have something for random.
Right. Correct. Now, they can say, well, you know, Bible thumpers, they want to talk about God and all his attributes. That's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm telling you that there was an intelligent entity, an intelligent force that acted upon nothingness and brought something into existence. And we call that God. Now, we could give it any name we want, but historically, mankind has called it God. That's what when we say we believe in God, on the most fundamental sense, that is what we are saying. And Christians need to understand that. There are things, I am convinced, there are things that I think about God that are false. I'm just sure of it. Now, I don't know what they are. If I knew, I wouldn't think them. Right? But I know they're there. They have to be there. It is not possible that everything I think about God is true. So I need to understand that as a Christian, when I say I believe in God, I am going back to that fundamental statement of Hebrews. I believe that he is. There is a creator, an intelligent entity that brought everything into existence from nothing. He just made it. Now, I'm not saying that he didn't make it through evolution. I'm not saying he didn't make it through a natural process. It has nothing to do with that. I'm not denying that or affirming that. All I'm saying is that there is a first cause for everything. There was a time when nothing that is was, and he or it, however you want to put it, it's not the point right now, made it. Caused it to be. And this is a really good argument for that. Because if the universe began to exist and everything that exists has a cause, everything that exists has a cause, then it follows that the universe has a cause. Now, there's a second part to this, goes a little further, and let's look at that. So we could start by saying, first point would be the universe has a cause. Now, if you've accepted the first argument, this is where you're at. The universe has a cause. Why does it have a cause? Because it began to exist. And everything that begins to exist must have a cause. So the universe has a cause, okay? That's where we're at. If you've accepted those first three statements, which is very, very difficult to not accept those. Those are very solid statements that most scientists cannot reject, okay? So the universe has a cause. If the universe has a cause, then an uncaused personal creator of the universe exists, who, without the universe, is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and enormously powerful. And then the conclusion to that is, therefore, an uncaused personal creator of the universe exists. So this is the argument. We've accepted that the universe must have a cause. If it has a cause, then it must have a personal creator who made it. And that creator has to be outside the universe. And he must be causeless. He doesn't have a cause because he didn't begin to exist. You understand? You say, well, if everything has to be made by something, who made God? God is causeless because he did not begin to exist. If they could prove that the universe never began to exist, then we could entertain the idea that there was no God. But if it began to exist, it had to come into being by some intelligent force. There's no other way. See, science is based on the idea of observing what you can observe, right? What you can predict. This is what it's based on. Predictability, observability. We have no observability, no predictability of anything coming into existence except by intelligence. None. It doesn't matter how much we watch, how much we observe. It always requires intelligence to bring something into existence. I read all the time articles, or headlines I should call them. They're headlines, because you read the article, you get a different story. That's right. But you read the headline. Scientists have created life. Evolution is possible. Right. Scientists have done this. Evolution is possible. There is no God. We've proven it because we have put together billions of dollars and thousands of intelligent people, and they have worked for hundreds of years, and they've come up with this, and that proves that things happen without intelligence and without money and without resources. This is exactly what they're saying. All you have to do is, look, I'm not trying to be mean. I hope you notice I'm being very fair-minded to their point of view, but that is the exact opposite. If you have to have a state-of-the-art laboratory with world-class scientists running it and investing billions of dollars into the research to come up with something, you can't say that that's evidence of unintelligence. That's right. All they're proving is that nothing comes into being without intelligence. Right. Nothing. We all know this to be the case. We know it empirically. We see it every day. We never look out and see a cityscape, a whole, all the buildings in San Antonio and think, I wonder where those sprouted up from miraculously. Right. The better the design is, the closer it fits to a universal sense of aesthetics, the more intelligence we attribute to it, yes. Not less. We don't look at a building that is really well built and think they finally got the right amount of unintelligence working there. Right. No, it's not how we think. That's right. And it's not just in that simple center. These are simple things, and they're not exactly scientific proof, so I want you to mistake them for that. I'm just trying to give you a sense of understanding that this translates into science as well. All scientists know that if they want something to come into existence, it's going to require intelligence and effort. That's right. Nothing else. In no other way does it work. That's right. And anything an intelligent being does that results in something coming into existence only proves the point. They say, well, all we did was throw all those things together and shake them. Right, but you had to throw them all together and shake them.
In the right order.
Right? To properly prove that something can come from nothing, you would have to start with nothing.
That's right.
You can't start with starting with a little bit isn't the same. It's like, well, we didn't start with a lot. It doesn't matter. Anything is infinitely more than nothing. Infinitely more. Okay. So that's this idea. So when we look at this argument, the argument is pretty simple. And the argument goes that if something comes into being, it must have a cause. The universe came into being. Therefore, the universe does have a cause. Anything that has a cause must have a personal creator who is causeless. So at some point, there must be something that never came into existence. Now you say, well, that's hard to believe. I understand. But so is the idea that everything came from nothing at all.
That's impossible.
Right. That's impossible, yes. Mm-hmm. Personal means that there is something that has an agenda. It's not a random thing. It's not something that acts without volition. So it doesn't mean personal like you have a personal relationship that way. It means that there is a first cause that is more than just a force. Right. It has a will, it has a volition, it has a purpose, whatever that might be.
Otherwise you would have no design.
Right, otherwise you would have no design. You can't have design without a sense of aesthetic, right? A sense of wanting things to be a certain way for whatever reason. So that's what we mean by personal creator. Okay? And it also has to be, and this is not in there, but I think it applies, it must be a single source. Must be. You cannot have more than one all-powerful God. It just isn't possible. It's logically not possible. Which is kind of goes back to what we've been talking about over the last few weeks and things about how we perceive God. But we must understand there cannot be more than one God. Monotheism is not a statement of faith. It is a logical conclusion. You cannot have more than one God. Because then neither one can be all-powerful.
Or all-knowing, or all.
Right. Because the other one could counteract it somehow. Right? And so in that moment, either one is all-powerful and the other one is really not a God, or neither one of them are all-powerful and neither one of them are really God. Which is kind of the argument, although not exactly, but it's kind of the argument that Paul uses in Acts chapter 17, and you can go read it, where he argues against idolatry, and really it comes down to this idea that there can only be a single creator. One. There can't be more than one. Why? Because it requires this omnipotence, this all-powerfulness, unconstrainability. And you can't have that if you have other gods who have equal force or greater. So that's kind of where we're going at with that. Does that make sense to you, John Michael? Anybody else have any questions or comments on this? Okay. So now let's look at one of the principal problems, and we'll try to get a little into this. And that is what's called theodicy, or the problem of evil, right? And that is, this is a general complaint that people have. And so generally if you talk to somebody who's thinking, there's a lot of people who deny God exists because they think it makes them sound cool, right? Or it makes them sound intelligent. And those people, they're hard to talk to because they're not being sincere, okay? Denying God's existence doesn't make you intelligent. Just like affirming God's existence doesn't mean you have faith either. There's a lot of Christians that affirm a lot of things they don't understand because they think it makes them sound like the people of faith. And that to me is just as problematic as people who deny these things because it puts them in the in crowd of the intellectuals they think. I think it's equally problematic. So I think Christians ought to understand what they're saying. Just because you're saying what's right doesn't mean that you're saying it right. So it's very important we understand it. But if you talk to someone who's thinking, this is one of the main issues that they might raise that is difficult to explain. especially once we get, and it's not, you'll see right now that where we're at this moment, this actually is not a problem at all. But as we get into more of a biblical perspective of who God is, it becomes something that's a little harder to explain. And it becomes something that requires a certain measure of faith. But at this moment, we're not talking about the God of the Bible. We're just talking about this personal creator, this intelligent being who brought everything into existence. And we say, well, there cannot be a God because there's so much suffering in the world. That doesn't follow. That doesn't follow at all. Okay, let me try to explain why. The fact that there is something that brought things into being does not imply that he's good. That's an assumption you would be making right now. You have to make the assumption that that creator is good and doesn't want suffering. And that just simply is an assumption that's not warranted. Let me try to give you an example of this and how I feel that this is really pretty, I would say that it is unreasonable to use this problem of evil to say that there is no creator. So it's kind of like you saying that you live in Florida, but you don't have a problem because you don't believe in hurricanes. Because hurricanes would be random and unfair. Therefore, they can't exist. Well, they do exist. It doesn't matter whether you say they don't. They do. And if you live in Florida, you will deal with them, whether you believe in them or not. And so when we talk about the existence of God, the argument that God isn't the way I like him to be is a poor argument. We're not talking about God as a statement of faith or as a religious dogma. We're talking about, is there an intelligent existence that brought everything into being? He is timeless, he is changeless, and he is all-powerful. And if there is, it doesn't matter whether he's good or bad, mean or nice, it makes no difference. He just is. And it's interesting, right, when we go back to what I told you about Exodus. So, God's speaking to Moses, and he tells him, you go and you tell him I sent you. And he says, who am I saying sent me? And God's answer there was, I am. Meaning, you're going to have to accept me as I am. You don't get to define me. You don't get to structure me. You don't get to order me into what you want me to be. I am what I am. And that is the first point that you have to understand about God. There are things, when we talked about, we got into this a little bit when we were talking about grace and about all these things, and some people were a little bit taken aback. They didn't like the idea, thinking that God could change his mind or other things that I was suggesting. And I think some of this comes from the idea that we can constrain or constrict God to a certain attribute, to a certain way of being. But when we're having this discussion here, on this level, you have to understand that there is no restriction on God, how God can be. That the world exhibits a level of suffering is meaningless to the existence of God. Exactly right. I don't want to sound callous, that's not what I'm saying. But in this discussion, does God exist? It doesn't make any difference if there's suffering everywhere. It means nothing. It is not part of that formula. God can exist and everything can be suffering. God can exist and nothing can be suffering. God can exist and can be any other proportionality of those two things or anything else. Because the existence of God does not, in and of itself, relate to this. Now, like I say, is the God of the Bible the God that brought everything into existence? Is he the true God, we would say? Well, this question's a little bit more fitting to there. This is something that's a little more difficult to answer, but that's an entirely different question. It's one that needs to be addressed, and we probably ought to get into that some other time. But all we're looking at right now is, things come from nothing, which is highly improbable, Or did everything that came into being have a cause, and that first cause, that intelligent cause of these things, we call that God? I think that that conclusion is warranted. Thank you. I think that is a warranted conclusion. I think that people who say that God doesn't exist haven't put very much thought into it, generally speaking. I'm not talking about intellectuals who have put a lot of time into it. I'm talking about the average person you talk to, the average young person that says, I don't think God exists because, and they have some reason. Usually it's this reason. Sometimes it's other reasons. But those reasons really don't hold up to scrutiny when we're considering this. And this is why I think that as Christians we need to not be afraid, not be against having this type of a philosophical discussion on these things. We do have to start from somewhere. That's what Paul did in Hebrews. When we go back to our text that we started off with in Hebrews, that's what Paul did. He says, we must first believe that he is. That is the first step that you have to take. This idea that somehow discussing these things and thinking about them outside of the Bible is wrong, well, that's silly. Right. Tell me how did Moses think about it? Right. He wrote the first 5 books. So before Moses, there's nothing. How did he think about these if he wasn't thinking about them in the context of proof texting? What verse did Moses quote? And how did the first Christians think about these things without the New Testament? How did they get along for 30 years without the New Testament? How did they preach without it? Well, we can go to Acts 17 and find out how they preached without the Bible. Acts 17 has no references, no direct quotes. Probably, in my opinion, not even indirect, but that's debatable. But there are no direct quotes in the entire sermon preached about the existence of God. You know who Paul quotes? The only quote in Acts 17? A pagan philosopher. Quotes them and proves to them with their own pagan philosophies that their philosophies about God are true. That those ideas they have are right. They just haven't extrapolated them properly. They haven't applied them properly. The pagan philosopher said, we are all children of him, speaking of the Creator. And Paul says that's right. That is correct. And if we're children of him, if we're made by him, then we shouldn't think that we can now make him. That's a logical argument. That is a philosophical argument. Now, I'm not telling you that we should throw the Bible away and all become philosophers. That's not what I'm saying at all. But we should not be afraid of considering these things from an intellectual perspective. I think one of the reasons why we are having such difficulty losing, especially the youth, to this materialistic, naturalistic worldview is because Christians are cocooning themselves inside of the Bible. This is not the way in which we find the original Christians. Right. Paul was not cocooned inside of the Scriptures. Do you realize he has entire segments of discussion in the New Testament? Now that we call it the Scriptures. But when he was doing it, it wasn't the Scriptures, it was Paul talking. Yeah. Where he quotes no verses. Go and count how many times, how many verses Paul quotes in Romans. There's a lot of them in there in comparison, and it's not that many. It's not that many. Romans chapter 3 is very unique in that it has a very long, extensive quote that's actually not normal. Paul gives a lot of argumentation, a lot of his own reasoning, explanations on things. We need as Christians to not be afraid of thinking about things, considering them from all angles and perspectives. Does anybody have any questions on this? All right. Well, we're out of time for today, so thank you for your attention.